All right, welcome everyone. We're so delighted that you're able to be here this evening for this town hall with Senator Schumer on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. We're so grateful for the senator's work to get the bill passed, but also really grateful for him to be here tonight to talk about what it means for New York City. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has the potential to reshape New York City for the better with investments in the transportation, resiliency, and internet infrastructure that our neighborhoods need for years to come. And we have a great opportunity tonight to hear from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who led the way in getting that bill passed, to talk about what it'll mean for New York City and how we organize together to make it happen. So Senator, thank you so much for partnering to do this. It's really in a challenging time, very hopeful for the future of New York City. Thank you for getting it passed and for coming on tonight to help us talk about what it means for New York City. Oh, all right.
Heard the one about the Triboro Bridge rail line?
I'll be impressed if you have a punchline to that one.
I'll figure one out.
Majority Leader, thank you so much for being here. The work that you are doing right now to lead is daunting, and the fact that this infrastructure bill got passed and is now going to provide resources for resiliency and infrastructure and investment and jobs in New York City, that's pretty powerful. So we're really honored to have the chance tonight to talk with you about what it means for New York City.
Great. Well, thanks, Brad. First, I want to say thank you. One of the reasons all of us are so lucky to have Brad as a leader in our city, he's a great collaborator. He collaborates with just about everybody, and working on this town hall together has really been pleasurable. Thank you. I want to start, of course, with some thank yous, a special shout out to our brothers and sisters in labor at the CLC. If this law means one thing, it's a four-letter word, J-O-B-S, jobs, jobs, jobs. Good paying jobs, more jobs, union jobs, jobs for people of color, jobs for people who've never had good paying jobs before. It's great. So I want to thank Vinny Alvarez for his leadership and his support in getting this across the finish line. I also want to thank some of our other great co-sponsors, Transportation Alternatives. We just did a great event with Danny Harris, the Bike Boom event. They named it that. I wish I had. Maybe that's the punchline to the Triboro Bridge. Is it going to be a bike boom over that bridge? There should be. Just our own Brooklyn Bridge just got their new bike lane on the lower level, which was a great thing.
I haven't ridden it yet. Have you ridden it?
No, not yet. I've been too busy. I've been down here.
I see that.
But I can't wait. It's so much better. It was such a nightmare trying to ride your bike across the Brooklyn Bridge with all the pedestrians and tourists, et cetera. Anyway, New York League of Conservation voters, Julie Ty, Bike New York, John Orcutt. And so that's all great. So let me just say a few things about the great BIF that we're talking about. It's historic. It's a historic bill. It's more investment in infrastructure than we have seen probably ever in America. The act, and it's comprehensive. It means more roads and bridges, more subways, as I said, more jobs, but also it really represents an investment in the public sphere. Infrastructure is a public charge, and it helps us and brings our world closer together. It's sort of a larger vision to put faith back in government that has been lost. The kind of infrastructure we need in this country, whether it's the traditional infrastructure or the new green infrastructure, cannot be done by the private sector. You need really strong, active government involvement, either directly or encouraging, and we do that. And so that's a very important point. Another point is that infrastructure, especially in a place like New York, it connects us, it binds us. It brings the diversity of America together, of New York together in so many ways. So it's great, not just for the actual building of the new infrastructure, but for what it does in terms of restoring government and bringing us together and binding us. So I thank you for that. And I say this about this, Brad. You know, the word historic gets thrown around a lot, sometimes true, sometimes not so true. But when we call this act historic, that's the truth. The BIF has set us on a course to spend as high a share of our GDP on infrastructure as we did during the New Deal. Isn't that incredible? With a much larger economy. The act's going to mean bridges and roads, trains and wires, and jobs, 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 as I said. But it's really, really important. So this is a great opportunity, and I look forward to working with you as the controller and working with the federal agencies to make sure it gets implemented properly. Getting all the money out there, step one, but getting it implemented is step two. And we're going to be a 1-2 punch. I'm going to make sure the feds give the money to New York without getting in the way of our unique needs. And you're going to make sure it's implemented well, and we'll do great together.
I like the 1-2 punch idea. Thank you so much. I'll start with saying that we've got so many co-sponsors that the senator thanked a few of them. I'll thank a few more. We've got the Center for an Urban Future, who do such good work on infrastructure and what's needed to make it work better. Citizens Budget Commission, who watch the capital budget. Jobs to Move America, who make sure those jobs are local and good ones. The New York Building Congress, the Regional Plan Alliance, and Writers Alliance. So thank you all for co-sponsoring. As the majority leader said, this is a big opportunity, and that's true for the whole country, but it's really true for New York City, where we rely on our infrastructure. And of course, the details of how that money gets spent will really matter. So we want to get down into a little more detail on what the federal infrastructure dollars will mean for New York City, and also on how we make sure those investments really advance equity, advance climate resiliency, bring better transit. And those are the questions we're going to be talking about tonight. Mostly what I'll be asking the senator are questions that were developed by our co-sponsors and by a lot of you audience members who sent them in ahead of time. Senator, that was the famous flip phone. Oh, you're on mute though. Wait, you're on mute, Senator.
Out. I said,
there we go.
This is one of my little secrets. How do I get a caucus that's so diverse, running from Sanders to Manchin, to try with only 50 votes, no margin for error, together? It's called talking. I don't email people. I talk to them. I know the phone number of I've memorized the phone number of every one of my Democratic senators. They have this number. When they call me, no intermediary, I pick it up. I recommend it. I am not a slave. I'm not always at a meeting looking in my lap when there's a little beep and going, oh, what was that? I recommend these flip phones. They're not in service anymore. There's some new ones. But I bought 20 of them, and I'm on number 18.
The infrastructure bill does not include funding for old cell phone technology.
No, it should. It should.
So
Anyway.
Talk to us a little about essentially a little more about what's in the bill for New York City.
Okay, let me go over a few of the things. There's so much. One of them is internet access. Internet access is a necessity these days. You know, Franklin Roosevelt got every home wired for electricity. And he said it was a necessity in the 1930s. Well, broadband is the same necessity in the 21st century. It's so essential. I always like to tell this little story. Well, I won't. But originally the idea was let's wire up all the rural areas that don't have broadband because of the last mile. And I said, wait a minute. We have a lot of people in New York City, maybe a quarter of our population, who can't afford broadband. But they're not far away from the fiber. They just can't afford it. And this is I will tell the story. I met a lady in central Brooklyn last June. She said, I'm so proud. She was a hospital worker. And she said, I saved $700. I bought my son a computer. He's starting the first grade, and I'm so proud I got him the computer. Now he'll be able to learn and participate in a real way. I saw her in September. How's your son doing? Not so good. What's the matter? I lost my job. I can't afford the $70 a month for broadband. We need to help that lady too. So in this bill is $15 billion so that poor people in the inner city who have been disconnected can get broadband. So that is really important. It also prevents price discrimination based on your address, a practice that's left New York City's communities of color often disconnected so that they don't have the kind of broadband they need. And it accelerates the adoption of broadband connections through digital literacy training and workforce development. So it's really comprehensive, and so much of New York City that has been left out. Second, and this is an obvious one, the MTA. I mean, we all know the subways are the arteries of our city. We like living densely, New Yorkers. We like bumping into each other. But without a subway, we couldn't do that. The cities would be one of those sprawled out cities. I won't be pejorative about them, but it's not where I would choose to live, and probably most of you. And it was easy to underestimate how dire it was with the MTA back in the pandemic. It was going to just shut down and lay off half its workers. I worked hard, and we saved the subways, along with lots of the groups on this Zoom, on this town hall meeting. We got over 14 billion. We didn't lay off anybody. You lay off a lot of these skilled workers, they don't return. And now in the new bill, we put in another 10 billion. So for just for New York City, to grow things like the Second Avenue subway, things like East Side Access, and something that people don't know, but one of the reasons we have delays is we have this really old signaling system. This will be enough money to update the whole signaling system so the trains run more quickly and more reliably. And now, of course, one other thing in the bill. By the way, in addition to the 10 billion directly for New York, there's an additional 20 billion that we can apply for, a total of 89 billion for mass transit, more than we've ever gotten. I've been an advocate of mass transit, and being majority leader helps a little bit in getting that money. One other thing, I won't go for all of it, bikes. We have $289 million for the traditional transportation alternatives program, and $5 billion for safe streets for all in the whole big bill. This enables us to do local Vision Zero programs. New York has a very strong one. Lots of more bikes, lots of more bike lanes, lots of more safety for bikes, a huge amount of money, much more than we have ever seen. People know me, I like to ride my bike everywhere. I hasten to add, I am not a spandex guy. I'm not whizzing by at 40 miles an hour. I take it in, I stop, I talk to people, I see what's going on, but I don't get much time to relax these days, but if I can take 2-3 hours off on a weekend and just ride around the neighborhood, I love to do it. This is going to make us safer, and it's going to make bike riding more available. You know, you go to a city like Amsterdam, a quarter of the people commute by bike. We should aspire to something like that. So there's a lot of money for bikes. That's just a few of the things that's been in there. There are a lot of other things for roads and bridges, electric vehicle infrastructure. This is something I pushed for, 7.5 billion to put charging stations around so people are more eager to use electric cars to prevent pollution. But let me ask you this, Brad. So I know you've been a leader on tracking the way to spend our money, even before you were, well, you're not yet, before you were Comptroller-Elect, and you're pushing reforms to have it done not only in a wiser way, a smarter way, but a more equitable way, so communities of color and others included. A key challenge of this spending is to make sure the money gets out that way. So I know you've been thinking a lot about your upcoming role as controller. Tell us a little about how we're going to implement and ways I can be helpful.
Thank you, and thanks for that summary. I'll mention that on the broadband that you mentioned, we actually did a survey that we'll be putting the results of out in a couple of weeks as we surveyed New Yorkers on what was working and not working in their neighborhoods. And lack of internet access was brought up by New Yorkers of color much more than by white New Yorkers. Actually popped as a top tier issue amongst low-income New Yorkers and New Yorkers of color. So that's like one example.
Let me tell you one little story. My wife works for the New York Public Library. When the libraries close at 6 in the poorest of neighborhoods, the seats are all filled, immigrants, poor people, et cetera. The kids, even in their coats in the winter, will gather along the walls of the library to get the bleed from the Wi-Fi. And you go, I went a few times. They're not doing video games, they're doing their homework, but they don't have Wi-Fi at home. That's why we need it.
Yep. So to your question, which is really a critical one, how do we spend this money wisely, like prioritize the right projects? And it's great to hear the signal system is in there, because that's actually the biggest thing we can do to get our trains running on a more timely fashion, but not everybody's focused on it. But we also need to do the work to strengthen how our capital projects are managed. So it isn't the case as it is now that more than half the projects go over time and over budget. So one of the bills I got passed last year is to create a transparent capital projects dashboard, a capital projects management system. And I've already started talking to the mayor-elect, to Eric Adams, about how we strengthen our procurement process. One great thing that we started doing in New York City not that long ago is design build. So we don't have to bid out the architecture work. If you're building a new house, you want to make sure you got an architect that designs it first. But a lot of these infrastructure projects, it makes sense to put your architect and your contractor together so we can expand design build. We can make sure that between the Comptroller's office and City Hall and the City OMB, there's a much more, a stronger working relationship, that we provide transparency on the projects. And I've actually put up, and will share with people who are interested, a sort of deep agenda for how we can improve capital projects management reform. And the nice thing about that is some of that is making sure we spend that money the most effectively, we get our money's worth, and we get projects done on time. But it also gives us more opportunities to make sure that people are really getting those jobs. There's some new opportunities in this bill to do local hiring. Previous bills like this had a ban on using local hiring provisions for construction projects, but those have been lifted. So New York City's got a lot of great opportunities to take advantage of these capital projects to drive our economy, to create good jobs, but that means getting the money out on the streets quickly. So that really is something that that I plan to work on, and as we need your help, we'll be doing it, because I know since you get the money out here, you want to make sure it's spent.
You got it.
Let me ask you a question. You talked about, I think a lot of people have talked about the ways in which roads and bridges are, got an awful lot of this money. New York City has seen, as you know, these once in a lifetime storms over the last few months. We lost New Yorkers during Hurricane Ida, and there's a lot of anxiety, for good reason, about the climate future we're facing. Now, the sewer infrastructure is underneath the roads. So I guess my question here is, are there opportunities to integrate, can use that federal infrastructure money for roads, but then figure out, I don't know if we're using dollars that are financed through the water board and the city itself for the sewers? What are the opportunities to make sure we're leveraging this infrastructure bill to get the most climate resilient city that we can?
Yeah, well, it's a great point. And anything I do in infrastructure and anything we do, we try to do resilience. So even as early as Superstorm Sandy, when we were able to get New York close to $60 billion, we insisted that everything was rebuilt. The old FEMA way was you have to build it exactly as it was before. Well, that made no sense. So we changed it for the first time, and we said resilience has to be built into it. So when the next storm and the next flood occurs, it would be resilient. And it's worked in a lot of ways. A lot of our new roadways are resilient. You go through our tunnels, they got those big doors, and in recent flooding, we've had record floods this fall. The tunnels weren't flooded the way they were last time. But you bring up a great point. Our infrastructure is not just roads and bridges. Water and sewer infrastructure is very, very important. And so we have a historic investment in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Sewer Overflow and Stormwater Reuse program. They're key tools for New York. There's over $11 billion in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Again, more than we've ever had. And New York gets just one of the very biggest proportions. I always make sure, that's one of my jobs as majority leader, that the formulas favor rather than disfavor New York. For so long, they had disfavored New York. Now we're getting them to favor New York, whether it's housing or transit or water. And about half the money New York gets is going to be projects as grants rather than loans. A lot of our communities, and particularly disadvantaged communities, a loan system doesn't work, but grants will work. So that's very, very important, and we put it there. But we also, and for instance, take Ida. I think you were there. We visited, even the president came to parts of Queens and Woodside and Elmhurst and places like that. And when the roads are slanted down and the sewage system isn't inadequate, people, many of them poor, live in basement apartments. They got flooded and died. The water would just cascade through the windows, which were at sidewalk level, and boom, gone. So there's going to be some real money now to redo those sewer systems and make people safe. And that is very, very important. Everything we do has to be done with resilience. We all know that climate's changing our city and changing our world. And, you know, it hit me when my grandson was born. He's now 3. But one of my favorite bike rides, to go back to one of my favorite subjects, is along the southern shorefront of Brooklyn, right along the Belt Parkway. There's just beautiful wetlands there, and it's relaxing and it's peaceful and in nice hills. And I ride down there through Coney Island. You're allowed to ride on the boardwalk before 10 a.m. and I see the statue of Pee Wee Reese and Jackie Robinson, which is, if you haven't seen it, Brooklynites, go see it. It's down by the stadium. I won't get into that now.
Have you ridden to the new Shirley Chisholm park over there by Starrett City?
Yes, I have.
That's a beautiful new park and a great ride as well.
Right on that ride. Well, if you go around Brooklyn through Bay Ridge, you can hit it that way, or you can hit it more directly. In any case, so I'm riding there about 2 weeks after my grandson is born, and it hit me like a bolt. This may not be there when he is older, because if the oceans rise a couple of inches, all that area is going to be gone. So the point of making us resilient, the point of building our roads so they can work better, the point of doing things that deal with the harbor and flooding through the harbor is all very important. And there's some good money in for all of those things in this bill. So tell me a little bit about the resiliency stuff you're doing as controller. Again, you'll have a lot to say to make sure what we built here in New York is resilient, able to resist the ill effects of climate change.
This is an area where we've got some real, we need to take this opportunity of the federal funds and plan as thoughtfully as we can. The city actually put a map together in the spring of where street flooding takes place, the kind of flooding that killed people in Ida. That's the places that we've got to make sure. And that's an opportunity to say, let's target the roads money on those roads. And while we're doing it, let's upgrade our sewer infrastructure. So, we are still overdue on a whole bunch of projects from post-Sandy. We actually have a whole set of the post-Sandy projects that still have not been completed. So we're going to put up a New York City climate dashboard that looks at a whole bunch of issues. It looks at getting the fossil fuel divestment the New York City pension funds are working at, looks at implementation of this local law that requires our buildings to retrofit for energy efficiency, but we're also going to make sure that it tracks progress on our resiliency projects. So we, really keep a sharp eye on it and make sure we don't let this opportunity.
Let me ask you this, Brett. Are there any regulations that we can put in place to make sure, I know you will, and I imagine Eric Adams will, but using your experience here and your thought, I think we should not even send money around if people aren't going to, if different cities and localities and states aren't going to make these things resilient, because it's wasted. They'll just get flooded again and again.
Absolutely. Whatever. And there are some, here we're doing some of that work, but it's an industry that's built up over a long period of time. And there's a lot of places where people will just do things the way they've always done them. So I do think some federal standards that insist on resiliency investments, where you have to say for each project, how is this project preparing for our climate future? I do think that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you a question that was suggested by our friends at Writers Alliance. They're very excited about the MTA money. I think they have some concerns on the MTA side that there's so much debt right now. The MTA capital program requires taking on a bunch of debt is then going to put pressure on fares and service. Can federal aid substitute for money that was going to be borrowed by
That's exactly right. The federal money we've tried to make rather flexible, and debt, not just in New York City, but in many of the transit systems, particularly the older ones, is a severe problem. It squeezes things out. I was glad that the governor said that she was going to use some of the money to make sure that fares didn't go up over I think it was the next year and a half. But if we can, a much longer term way to do that is have some of the federal money buy down the debt, so the city's money has more flexibility and doesn't have to raise fares. And it can be used for that purpose. Absolutely.
One area that I guess I have a question about what's in the infrastructure bill and what is still in Build Back Better that I know you are continuing to fight for is I'm actually at an event right now with a whole bunch of NYCHA residents. We're actually here celebrating the the Gowanus rezoning, which was passed 2 weeks ago to bring a whole lot of new affordable and mixed income housing. And we want a big investment in the public housing of Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens. But NYCHA, as you know, has billions and billions of dollars of unmet needs. Is there anything in the infrastructure bill for public housing?
Let me, in the infrastructure bill, no. Here's a pretty good rule of thumb. So the infrastructure bill was done in a bipartisan way, Democrats and Republicans. But there were two things that Republicans didn't want. They were willing to do traditional infrastructure. They were even willing to take a few steps a little further, like with the bikes, the hiking paths and things like that, as well as the charging stations. But by and large, it was traditional. The Build Back Better focuses in 3 areas that are not in the BIF bill, and this is what we're working hard to pass, hopefully before Christmas. One is anything to do with climate. Our Republican friends, unfortunately, I don't want to make this partisan, but I have to speak truth to power. They are totally against doing things on climate, in large part because the oil, coal, and gas industries fund so much of them. Something was estimated once that a quarter of the dark money that the Republican Senate Campaign Committee gets is oil, coal, and gas. You'd be amazed how much coal money there is out there. They all want to keep their coal mines operating, even though it's poison for our atmosphere. In any case, so there wasn't much. This bill does dramatic things on climate. Number one, it changes our whole tax structure so that clean energy gets precedence. Real breaks for solar, for wind, for water, so that our goal in that regard, even stronger than New York State CLCPA, which was very strong and good, and which I helped push the former governor to pass, and the legislature as well. There, even in the CLCPA, they didn't go as far as this. We say 80% of the energy by 2030, only 9 years from now, has to be clean. And then not only do we work on energy, we have a bill that I had called Clean Cars in America, whose goal it is that all the new cars sold in America will be clean by 2030, and every car on the road clean, meaning electric or hydrogen, will be clean by 2040, is in there, as well as all kinds of things to deal with new technologies, with agriculture and everything that emits things into the atmosphere. So that the overall goal, very hard, but we're struggling to get it. We have a guy named Joe Manchin we have to work with on this, not so easy, is that 50% reduction in the amount of carbon that goes into the atmosphere by 2030. That's huge. So there's a lot of climate things. A second huge area is what I call families, and it covers a lot. Universal pre-K. We have pre-K in New York City, but not in the rest of the state and not in the country. It works. The studies are dramatic in terms of pre-K. We have also childcare. This is very, very important. In the United States is backward on childcare. Of the 37 developed and semi-developed countries where 30, only Turkey is lower, people have to pay, poorer people, middle-class people have to pay so much for childcare. And the world has changed. When I was a kid, my father had this little exterminating business, not very successful, but my mom was home. She was a housewife. That was what it was called in those days. So when someone got sick, someone had to go to a funeral, the car broke down, someone was out of town, there was always a parent home. Today, only 16% of the families with kids are 2 parents, 1 working. They're either 1 parent or 2 parents, both working. Childcare is a necessity. We say you pay 7% of your income and you get good childcare. That's in the bill as well. We're fighting to get paid sick and family leave in the bill, all kinds of things that will help families, okay? The third area, well, I'm gonna mention 4. The third is housing, public housing. I am passionate about public housing. And we have put there was no housing money in the Biden original bill. Housing is often neglected. We're so short of housing, particularly for lower income people, but across New York City. So we put about $150 billion into housing, including significant dollars to help our NYCHA developments. You can tell the folks that you're meeting with that there will be really good money to redo. In the 70s, when someone got a place in public housing, they were happy. was good housing that they could afford. It is so deteriorated, whether it be the drains and the leaks, or the elevators, or the heat, or the vermin, or the mold, you name it, that we need a massive investment. The federal, state, and city governments over the years have disinvested. We put a big investment in that, but we also put in more money for affordable housing, more money for homeless housing, more money for vouchers. And all of these things, whether it's climate or housing or any of the others, we put in huge amounts for job training. And we say that communities of color, poorer people, as well as unemployed and lowly employed or part-time, get preference for a lot of these jobs. And then there's job training with often a pathway to a union job. We'll take million people and give them good middle-class jobs for the rest of their lives. And all of this is paid for by taxing the very wealthy, both corporate and individual. No one in the middle class pays taxes on this. So it's a damn good bill. It's going to be, we're working really hard to get it done. I need to get all 50. Any one member can sink it, and every member comes up, I want this, I want that, I want this. But we're working hard to get it done, hopefully before Christmas.
That's great. Thank you. We're rooting for that very, very hard. That's for sure. Let's talk a little more about the jobs in the infrastructure bill. It's called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And let's talk a little about what kind of jobs we can expect to see in New York City and what opportunities there are to make sure the investment really contributes to the city's economic growth and recovery. I know that the recent study by our co-sponsors here, Jobs to Move America, they've been fighting really hard to make local hiring more possible. There's used to be a ban on local hire provisions for federal construction projects, which meant you couldn't, require that those jobs go to people in frontline communities. They've shown that those kinds of provisions, which are now legal, don't raise prices, don't make things take longer or reduce competition. So that seems pretty exciting. And obviously a lot of these jobs will come with a prevailing wage requirement. So they're not poverty wage jobs.
Not a lot, all are prevailing wage, and in every case, union jobs too. So these are good paying jobs, and it'll pump a lot of money into our economy. Sorry.
That's exactly what, yeah. So, I know that, I know that Jobs to Move America and others are sort of trying to organize people around best practices to implement really good local hiring requirements, that kind of job training you just mentioned, working with our unions to make pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs. So that might be another area where there's a possibility of asking people in how they're spending the money to demonstrate that they're making this commitment to good jobs and equity, and then connect people so we can all learn from each other and use some of the best practices that are out there.
You're right. And we do have a local hire provision. Not only was the ban lifted, but I made it a priority to make sure that there would be local hire, and it ensures that historically disadvantaged workers, women, people of color, low income, LGBTQ, disabled, and all of that have a priority here. So this is going to be very, very helpful. We also passed sweeping new Buy America requirements to make sure the construction products use American-made American products. There's been such a decline in manufacturing in America, and this will help boost that back up. Here's another good one that's very, very important in New York. We have about $15 billion to remove lead pipes. When young kids, as they're developing, get lead in their nervous systems, it leads to all kinds of problems. We still have a whole lot of lead pipes in New York. The city can't really afford to take them out and put new ones in. This is $15 billion for that. And what we've done in most of these jobs, especially on the environmental ones, is we've had three legs: one, climate; one, good paying jobs, union jobs. And I know Vinny Alvarez is on this call. He helped us do this, as did the New York City Central Labor Council, but also justice, dealing with communities, disadvantaged communities, and make sure they get the jobs. So this is going to be a real shot in the arm. There are going to be hundreds of thousands of new good paying jobs in New York State as a result of this.
That's great. And is that local hire provision, is that the first time? This is on such a scale that it's the largest, I'm sure, but I'm excited to kind of take a look at those provisions and see how we can implement them here in a way that really create the most opportunities for folks in low-income neighborhoods and public housing and frontline communities.
Yeah, I agree. So, no, that's a great thing. And let me ask you, Brad, tell me some of the kinds of projects that you're thinking about that could be used in these programs. There are so many, but you know the city well. Whenever I go around the city, I always see Brad Lander popping up right alongside. Tell me, give us some idea of some of those.
Yeah. One thing you and I talked about when we got together a couple of months ago that I'm really excited about is trying to do a very expansive rooftop solar program. I think we're looking to see what resources there are in either the infrastructure bill or Build Back Better, but we may be able to use some city resources as well. We have these amazing resources of our rooftops in New York City, but the current method of having each individual building owner have to go through the whole process of financing it themselves is going very slow. We're going to need to really dramatically double and then triple the pace. So we're looking at what we're calling Public Solar NYC, an effort to have the city in permitting, financing, and installing rooftop solar, and then aggregate that to negotiate with Con Ed to do more battery storage. So that's one project we're really excited about. And then one thing, a bill that was passed in the City Council that Speaker Johnson was the lead sponsor on, required the city to create a master plan for our streets to be more ambitious in the ways you were talking about, or that Amsterdam is. I actually got to go to Paris with my kids over the summer. Mayor Anne Hidalgo has done a remarkable job expanding the bike infrastructure, which makes it safer for cyclists, safer for pedestrians, gets people out of their cars, but only if you really build that infrastructure. So that streets master plan is really ambitious. And to implement it using these federal dollars, I think is going to be really important. And then the third thing I'll mention that you said, and I want to lift up, is electric car infrastructure. I'm nervous that New York City might lag behind on electric cars because, of course, in most of the country, people have their car in a garage and they can plug their electric car in overnight, but we don't have that here in New York City. So unless we build out a public charging infrastructure, it's going to be hard for people to have electric cars. That's a thing that the car companies, General Motors has committed. They're not even going to make gas-powered cars after 2035. But we better build out the infrastructure to power electric vehicles, or else our city will be left behind.
Yeah, and we do allow for that. I was aware of people live in apartment buildings, so they don't have a garage where they can put in a charging station. And what I envision is it's sort of like parking meters, where people, there's a charging place out on the street, and you get it's yours, and you can turn it on, turn it off, as well as some charging parks if we can find places for those in a densely populated place like New York City. But there is a lot of incentive dollars and tax incentives, both for the public sector and the private sector, to do much more of that. So it's very important. I agree with you. We need it. We very, very much need it. We're lucky we have our subways. Those are the cleanest and quickest and most efficient ways to go. Buses, we're trying to get as many electric buses as we can. We're trying, by the way, to make the post office have all electric trucks as well. But what you say is exactly right, and we need that. In terms of the solar roofs, that's a great idea. And I know we allow installation of solar. I'll make sure, I'll look at the regulations on the bipartisan infrastructure bill to see if the aggregate you're talking about and make sure that it be allowed to happen.
I want to honor the comments in the chat that say, okay, electric cars are good, but what we really need to do is get more people out of their cars. And I think the senator and I totally agree. That's why there's resources for infrastructure, for mass transit investment. Obviously, in New York City, the best thing we can do to get people out of their cars is have the subways working better, invest in some of those subway expansion projects, and expand bike infrastructure. Let's see, I have to give the most creativity points for this question because someone wrote in and said, this forum is great, but there are a lot of other issues we want to ask the majority leader about. So what about the infrastructure of our democracy?
Voting.
And I'm going to give them points for creativity and ask you to talk about what we're doing on voting rights and protecting democracy.
Well, there's just about nothing more important. And I'm sure most of your listeners here know what Republican legislatures are doing throughout the country is just despicable in a variety of different ways, making it much harder to vote. And Donald Trump propagated the big lie that the election was stolen. He called it the big steal, but I think on this one, we gained the messaging on him, and it's called the big lie everywhere, which it was. But importuned by that, Republican legislators throughout the country are trying to make it much harder for people to vote. They say there's voter fraud. They have no proof of it. And who are they trying to make harder to vote? Not everybody, but Democratic voters, people of color, poor people, young people, urban people. In a bunch of states, they say you're going to need a notary public. That's what they're trying to do, to come to your house if you want to vote by absentee. Poor people can't afford a notary public. In so many areas, they're limiting where early voting can occur. In some states, shouldn't be on Sunday. You know why? Because Black churches do souls to the polls. You know, people go to church, they didn't get a bus, go vote. They limit when you, they limit where you can vote. So in big cities, they say you can only have one early voting place. They put it in a place near no mass transit, no parking, so no one can ever get there. The list goes on and on. Then the reapportionment. This is even worse. They are taking, they are redrawing lines that are so fundamentally and undemocratic. Wisconsin, 53% of the people in 2020 voted for a Democrat for state assembly, but they have less than a third of the seats. The new redistricting lines they hope to draw in Ohio, which is slightly Republican, but not much, would be 13-3 Republican to Democrat, all that. And dark money cascading in. So the Freedom to Vote Act, which was much like the S1 vote, undoes all of that. And it undoes another thing, which may be worst of all. Listen to this, folks. This is like a third world country. In 8 states, they are saying that the legislature, Republican dominated, will determine who won an election, not the impartial boards of elections. And in Wisconsin, some right-wing sheriff of Racine County has indicted the voting election officials on trumped up charges. They're trying to intimidate. Okay. All of this could be undone with the Freedom to Voting Act, which 50 Democrats support. We've worked hard and got Joe Manchin to support it as well. So now we have all 50. But of course, it takes 60 in the Senate with these hide-bound rules that we have. So right now, as we speak, first, Joe Manchin said, I believe in voting rights. And it's true. When he was Secretary of State of West Virginia, he improved voting rights. But he said, let me see if I can get some Republicans to join us. We didn't think he would, but we gave him a chance. Now it's clear Republicans can't join us. So we are having a family discussion, intense, as we are speaking almost here, where we're going to Joe and the whole Senate and saying, okay, we can't do it with Republicans. Our democracy is at risk. How do we change the rules? We're working really hard at it because our democracy is at risk.
Thank you for answering that. Yeah, I give them credit for coming up with the infrastructure of democracy angle. And
if we don't have that, all these roads may not even be important anymore.
Amen. Amen. All right, there is so much in the chat. What I want to pledge to people is that we're going to find ways to keep the conversation going. We're lucky to have this much time.
I got to vote in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, so we're lucky to have this much time with the majority leader. What I want to pledge is that we'll find some ways to include people in the conversation about New York City's spending of this money. This is a great coalition of co-sponsors. A lot of you have a ton of questions about changing how we do trash collection and using the sidewalks more creatively. A lot of thoughts about how to do better bike infrastructure. A lot of comments about dealing with all these helicopters over our city. So there's a lot that's good in the chat. And what I guess I want to promise people is we're almost out of time with the majority leader, but we're going to make some more opportunities for people who care to weigh in on and pay attention to how we spend this money. Both what projects it goes for, how we make sure the jobs get to the people who need them, how we build in those equity and climate provisions into this bill. So we'll be following up with everybody who registered and who's on and make sure we can continue this conversation as the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Senator, anything else you want to emphasize before we let you go?
Thank you. I know we have hundreds of people on this call. Your participation is needed. I know some people like to, say, throw up their hands. I'm frustrated, this, that. Apathy is probably our greatest enemy. There are very powerful forces trying to upend our democracy, trying to say government should shrink, we should cut taxes on the wealthy, all these kinds of things that will lead to a diminished society. And what we have going for us, people like Brad and me, is your activism, your concern, the fact that so many people got on this Zoom, this town hall meeting on Zoom, is really heartening. Please continue to fight the fight. What I have found in my years in politics is if you keep fighting, justice usually prevails. It may be a long, hard road. There may be detours along the way, logs in the path, but if you keep fighting, you win. So please continue to join us in the fight for more jobs, dealing with climate, making sure that our city can function well through its mass transit system, its biking and everything else, and keeping on democracy.
Thank you so much for all that. Thank you for taking this time. Thank you for keeping up the fight. We promise to keep doing it here. Good night.
Brad, it's always a pleasure. Let's keep doing things like this.
Here, here.
Great.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody. We'll be in touch. Have a good night.